is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my roll shop niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day pepping America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please, embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement, I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut, foreclosure Vic homes out the tenement, I twist words like a speech impediment, I hope you got good credit bitch, if not better get a new job with benefits, while I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with, new money buys brand new carrots, my old money bunch of great grandparents, you got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at you, I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building for each one of my children.
Welcome to Voice of Rebellion Radio. This is your host, Chris J. Today on two different topics. Just a general mix today. Comes to Trump. Talk about Syria a little bit, and talk about Putin a little bit. Apparently, some interesting interviews coming out soon between Vladimir Putin and Oliver Stone. They'll be released, something to call it the Putin interviews. Oliver Stone in a pretty close angle at the president of Russia with his interviews talking about Snowden and a few other things. Apparently those are coming out, I think on RT in a few weeks. I feel like last week we talked about that, is that we had a pretty big deaths when it came to one of the biggest globalists died, 89 years old, Zbigniew Brzezinski, died about, I think it was last week, he died, which, as many people call him, the godfather of Al-Qaeda. This man was a big part of sponsoring Mujahideen against the Soviets in the 70s and 80s, which later spawned off to become the Taliban. And, in fact, in the 1990s, pretty much the Taliban took power of Afghanistan, leading to very strict laws, and eventually the United States deposed the Taliban government in 2001, and the presidency of Mohammed Omar, and replaced it with a puppet government. Now we have what the kind of government they have in Afghanistan now, which completely pretty much is a client government of the United States. There's no sovereignty there, and it's not like Iraq where it was different, as it seems like Iraq took a different route than what the United States wanted them to do, and Iraq, despite having the puppet regime placed in power, they eventually turned into a pro-Iranian government and have severe distrust of the United States. And Iraq has actually kind of joined, we could say, the so-called resistance in beliefs. You know, the four countries, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Iraq's now in that sphere of resistance, and you know, this is one of the things that really shows that the tide seems to be turning when it comes to the United States foreign policy, is that for many years it looked like the United States was inching closer to total domination around the world of any regime that was hostile to them. And in the Middle East, there were only two countries away at one point. It was just Syria and Iran. But then Yemen had their revolution in 2015. The Houthi revolution deposed the pro-American government there, and Hadi was thrown out of power, and now they're in a civil war. However, currently Sana'a is controlled by the Houthis. And then in Iraq, you have what seems to be in the last couple of years a falling out between the United States and Iraq, and now the Iraqi government seems to trust Iran and even Russia more than America, and Iraq has now kind of partnered to fight against ISIS with Syria, and it's pretty much just one battle, because really ISIS is crossing over between Syria and Iraq, and I think that the Iraqi government, they're kind of in a corner right now, because the United States could intervene again if the Iraqi government was to go totally anti-American. However, at the same time, they don't want to repeat the mistakes of joining into the United States sphere. We look at what happened back in the 80s. When they were under the United States influence, they had the dictator Saddam Hussein. And it ended up into a violent circle of Saddam being thrown out, and then later he being deposed, and later on, Saddam Hussein's government was replaced by the American puppet government. Terrorism rose in the country. Iraq has not had a very good relationship with the United States. And I think at the same time also Iraq might be a little bit weary of Russia, considering of the past government of Qasim way back in the 60s. It was pro-Soviet. But his government was deposed by the Saddamists. These were people, there were Saddamists before Saddam was around. The Ba'athist Party of Iraq overthrew Qasim in, I think, 64, and then they ruled the country for like 15 years before Saddam actually took power in 1979. Saddam led the country from 79 to 03. And people a lot of times misattribute Saddam as being like part of the resistance. They say that he was like with Iran or with North Korea, but it's kind of false, because actually Saddam, for a long time of his presidency, was an American ally. 12 years, you could say, from 79 to 91. He gassed the courage with the help of the United States. Saddam Hussein also, I mean, he pretty much was a CIA asset, and he helped the United States attack Iran in the 1980s. And, you know, when you look at a true resistance country like Iran, that's why they chose Iraq to attack it. And when they assaulted Iran, Iraq also was being kind of backstabbed by the United States because they were selling weapons to Iran at the same time. But ultimately, in the end, it seemed like a move to weaken the Middle East. And Saddam's military was actually the fourth biggest military in the world, and the United States had that under the wing. They made also Saddam's military in the time of the late Cold War. So at first they were a pretty strong Cold War ally, but at the same time Saddam Hussein had relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union and the United States both backed Iraq in the Iraq-Iran War, and the only really other power to back Iran in the Iraq-Iran War was North Korea, which still Iran won the war and pushed back the invading forces to out of Iran. But it was a very bloody war. Like over 1 million people died in the Iraq-Iran War, and it's been the history of a lot of recent Middle East. There's just these bloody conflicts for a little gain for the people. You know, that ultimately in the end, whether the Syrians are going to have gain by years of civil war, whether the Yemenis are going to gain by years of civil war. And at this point, it's even called a civil war. I mean, this is a invasion from Saudi Arabia, but it seems like the international community is not calling them out on it. But Saudi Arabia has invaded a sovereign country, Yemen, bombed them, and this is also, remember, Yemen is the Middle East poorest country, and they already have a tough enough time as it is, and now they're being invaded by Saudi Arabia and are facing this onslaught. It's tragic. The tragedy of massive proportions, and already like over 10,000 people have been killed in the Yemeni civil war. It's much. It's a very brutal, a lot of bloodshed, and the fighting's everywhere, I think, in Yemen right now. And currently, the government that's trying to take power, this is a pro-terrorist government, I would call it. The government of Hadi and the ones in the Yemen, in the pro-American government that allowed Al-Qaeda to flourish in the country for many years, while the Houthis actively fought terrorism. The Houthis are like Hezbollah. They fight terrorism actively, but yet the United States designates them as a terrorist group, and they try to confuse Americans, saying that these people are in the same league as Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, when that's not true. They're usually the American allies, the Israeli allies in the Middle East are the ones that are in league with these terrorist groups, while in reality, Hezbollah, Houthis have been some of the major fighters of terrorism for decades in the Middle East. They point to some incidents by Hezbollah, especially I think like the 80s and stuff, as trying to pin them as a terrorist group. But ultimately, Hezbollah does not appear to be a terrorist group. They appear to be a resistance group against imperialism in different countries, Israel, the United States. And, you know, Russia doesn't call them a terrorist group. I think a few European countries don't call them as a terrorist group. Ultimately, one of the big terror groups in the Middle East is not listed as a terror group by the United States, it's Muslim Brotherhood. And Muslim Brotherhood is actually the original group to uprise in Syria back in the 80s against Hafez al-Assad. And during that bloody war, it was similar to what happened in today's time, but today's on large scale. Hafez al-Assad faced an Islamic uprising in his country but defeated it, and that's why I have confidence that Bashar al-Assad will be able to do the same. This is pretty much just like a continuation kind of what happened back then, and this is one way that the United States weakens powerful Arab countries, is that they attack them with Islamist groups, telling them to fight back against the secular movement in the country, and you see, that's what's pretty much going on in Syria. That's what's happened in Libya, and I read the other day is that apparently in Libya there's a chance that there could be an uprising of the Gaddafi loyalists, and Gaddafi loyalists could retake power. And in that power vacuum, finally made the Gaddafis could bring order to the country. Apparently there's a lot in the south of Libya, and I forgot the general's name that they've been rallying around, but that's the thing, is there's practically like two governments in Libya right now, and the Gaddafis are really the third choice. There's a Islamist government of Muslim Brotherhood. There's like a less Islamist government that is backed by like Egypt and United Arab Emirates, and then there's the Gaddafis. So just remember that anyone that uprose against Muammar Gaddafi was pretty much taking part of a terrorist insurgency, and that's the same thing in Syria, is that pretty much everyone that has uprose against Bashar al-Assad has taken part of a terrorist insurgency. I'm not saying that every single person that fought against Assad is a terrorist. What I'm saying is that ultimately the movement as a whole is an insurgency with, at the core, terrorists and backed by foreign powers such as the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. This is not, the Syrian civil war is hardly Syrian, because you have like 83 different countries where these rebels are from, and they're overthrown the Assad regime, ultimately to play into the imperialist hands. One major reason is the pipeline, is that the pipeline that Israel and Qatar want to build that runs through Syria. And then there's the pipeline that like Syria and Iran would build that goes to Russia. That's the current one that would be built under the Assad regime. So there's the pipelines that are also a big part of it, and also the fact that Assad does not have a Rothschild bank. But ultimately, Syria is being attacked by pretty much every reason but the ones that are being displayed on the TV, trying to tell you that the humanitarian reason that they're doing this to save the Syrian people. But ultimately, the policies of the United States government has killed many Syrian people, and ultimately the rebels have used many Syrians as human shields. Ultimately the Syrian government seems to be the sane alternative in this whole mess. People will lambaste me for this and say that I'm supporting a tyrannical fascist regime, but ultimately the Assad regime is being lied about a lot in the media. And ultimately the people that are the tyrannical fascists are the Syrian rebels, as they plan on putting a Wahhabi-type state in the country and may turn Syria maybe as backwards as Saudi Arabia. A lot of these people have conceptions of how society should be, like the people that run the Saudi government. This is no way to run a country. The Wahhabis that are fighting against the Assad regime should not be backed by the United States, and they should definitely not be backed by so-called leftists who say that they're supporting a revolution in Syria, not realizing the true revolution was completed in 1970 when the Ba'ath Party took power. Syrian revolution that's going on nowadays is a mercenary dismantling of the state by imperialists from overseas, from around the world. And any true anti-imperialist would stand by the Assad government and stand by Iran in their efforts to try to push that back and stand up to Israel. And that's they're one of the major players in the whole thing, is that Israel has been seen backing Takfiri fighters in the country, backing the Salafists, and back in the Salafists in the country, and it's one of the things that Israel and radical terrorism is not two things you really think of going together, but ultimately they actually do go very close together, because without they go very tight with each other. Go very tight together, because if it wasn't for radical Islam, Israel wouldn't be able to push the will on many secular regimes, such as the Assad regime, or even on the Iranian regime, which is not secular, but however it's a non-radical regime, and it's a regime that opposes Israel. They have helped terrorists there. Like I said, they go very close together. Assad, Iran, these are some of the main targets. And you notice that the countries that seem to get attacked the most by Islamic terrorism, which is Syria, Iraq, these are countries where Zionists have been trying to put more influence, and also they're part of the Greater Israel Project, is that they want land from Israel all the way to from the Nile River to the Euphrates River. If they were to complete this goal, they would have to take out Syria, and they'd have to take part of Iran, or part of Iraq. And, there's different ways that they plan on taking down Syria. I think that part of it might be splintering the Kurdish community from the rest of Syria. And I don't think that the Kurdish community as a whole are tools for Israel, like some people like to claim, but I think that they use the Kurds at times and try to influence their communities into trying to the strong belief that the Assad regime is taking advantage of them, so that they can splinter the country. Because the Kurds leave is a significant part of the country that leaves. And if you look at the map of what parts of the country are controlled by what side of the war, that the terrorists control a lot of eastern Syria, the Kurds control northern Syria, they control western Syria, that if ultimately that if the Syrians if the Kurds were to go, that's a lot less land for the anti-terrorist coalition in the country. And I'm not going to say like the pro-government side, because ultimately I don't think that the Kurds are necessarily pro-Assad necessarily. Maybe some of the Kurds are. I believe all the Kurds are very grateful for the Assad regime and their efforts to fight ISIS. And the fact that ISIS one of the major targets for ISIS is the Kurds, and the fact that they want to eliminate them. I mean, the Kurds are. I mean, the ISIS has been vicious against the Kurds, and the rebels have been also picking on the Kurds as well. Ultimately, the Kurds' only allies, I would think, true allies that they have are going to be the Assad regime and Russia. I don't even think that the United States really qualifies as true allies, because, again, they're just using them as pawns and trying to balkanize the country. And I believe it was part of an earlier Trump plan in order to go with balkanizing the country, be using the Kurds to try to split the country apart. Now it's went to a different strategy, which is now seems to be full attack mode, support the rebels, attack in favor of the rebels, and potentially a full-on strike coming on eventually, using many soldiers, boots on the ground, all out assault on Syria. Might be the next step for the Trump administration. If one of the major things that we've been able to pull apart from the Trump administration in the last few months is the fact that it's not what they were talking about at the beginning. That they were talking about this won't be business as usual. This is going to be different. We're going to actually have a practical America. And we see all these impractical foreign policy solutions. We see the same neocon dribble being pushed by the Trump administration. And you see now, Sean Spicer coming up to defend more neocon dribble. And even, Sean Spicer going as far as saying when it came to Assad is that not even Hitler used gas, which obviously a major error in the statement. But I know what he meant is that he didn't use gas in combat. However, obviously he did use gas somewhere else in exterminating people. But however, Sean Spicer made a ridiculous comparison trying to compare Bashar al-Assad to Adolf Hitler. Bashar al-Assad is Arab socialist. Well, you look at it, Adolf Hitler was a imperialist fascist, and Adolf Hitler was ultimately a corporatist when you think about the way that what fascism is at the core, is that he was a corporatist and believed in the merger of corporate and state power. That made him a fascist. He was a Nazi. The Nazi part, the National Socialist, which is just a shortening of the National Socialist. Ultimately, the word socialism in the use of the word National Socialism does not mean socialism as socialism in Syria, does not mean as socialism in Venezuela, it does not mean as socialism like the socialist policies they do have in Russia, it does not mean, like socialism in Cuba or socialism in Vietnam, which is, one of the major things I've noticed online seems to be the misconception that somehow that socialism in Germany was similar to the socialism of these different countries, and trying to say that ultimately Hitler was a socialist. But ultimately, Adolf Hitler really he was more of a corporatist, and his economy more reflected onto the economy of America today, or, I would say that really the closest example to America today as a whole, economy, society, everything, probably goes to Benito Mussolini's Italy. Seems to be a striking comparison, a striking resemblance to Benito Mussolini and his country. And the fascist regime in Italy, the way that they were able to seize power, the way they were able to, put that message, the populist message, into people's heads, and it was bad populism. They used populism as a bait in order to get the people behind this regime, similar to what Trump is doing right now. Is that it's pretty much going to the extreme. Is that that was one thing that was kind of missing in the whole fascist equation, I guess, from many years, for the most part, was this populism, and it went into more, instead it was more of a neoliberalist mentality, but it's still a fascism. Now it's a populist fascism that strikingly resembles Benito Mussolini with Donald Trump as the spokesman. And the thing is that in a fascist country, that ultimately that guy screaming and hollering and calls himself the leader is not really the one in charge. It's the big corporations, the big money backers behind them. And ultimately it's the same way here in this country. In Italy, they got rid of Congress, and they put the Union of Fascist Corporations. That's very similar. It's very similar to what seems to have happened today. Now, maybe they haven't officially changed the name of Congress, but ultimately they're all backed by corporate lobbyists. And ever since Citizens United, you can say that was almost like our moment where we changed over, where we became, where our Congress became ultimately just a union of corporations. Is now that money is determined to be free speech, and the people with a lot of money are going to be able to determine the policies of the country. One last obstacle to doing that. They've already been doing that for 100 years. And ultimately, when they printed our currency, it was game over. With the Federal Reserve and a private bank controlling the printing of a nation's currency, that's ultimately as far into fascism as it's going to get. Because when you have a ultimately the privatization of most services is actually a pretty big part of fascism, but at the same time, these private entities are still working together with the government. Like Pinochet's Chile, is that a lot of people call Pinochet's Chile, they think was a free country and it was the ultimate standard of freedom. I mean, I'm not saying a lot of people believe this, but, you see those people on the internet that believe this. And the alt-right community and even some of the libertarians that claim that Chile was so free, and often they point to the modern-day success of the country or whatever, and try to pin that on the policies of Pinochet, and at the same time trying to demonize socialism as a whole by showing the recent struggles of Venezuela. And if you took that completely out of context, it might look like you have a point there. However, historically, let's put a couple things in perspective, is that in the 1970s, Pinochet's been out of power for about 18 years now. That was when he was actually pulled as general. So Pinochet's been out of the government for a while now. And there was not, the whole idea that there was this economic success and everything is highly exaggerated. There was actually quite a few recessions. There was a lot of problems under Pinochet's Chile and his economy. You look into Venezuela is that actually, as long as Pinochet left the government around the same time that the fascists left the government in Venezuela. So you'd be talking about, you're comparing, you'd be saying that the policy, with that same argument, you'd say that the current problems of today in Venezuela were caused by the fascists of the 90s, 80s, and 70s, while Pinochet's success is somehow, resembles of today's Chile. However, Pinochet was not successful. For the last 10 years or so, Chile's been ran by a moderate socialist government, Bachelet, and it's not really that radical. In fact, I would say that Chile, they actually get a lot of backlash from the left of the country for some of their policies and still keeping some of the old structures of the Pinochet government. However, weirdly enough, I believe the chairman of the party that rules Chile nowadays is the daughter of Salvador Allende herself. So obviously there are some socialist roots to the party that controls Chile today. Bachelet's also been known to stand by Venezuela and stand by her neighbors. So she might be a very moderate socialist, as I mean, is that she's not even as moderate as, for example, Dilma Rousseff. I would say that she's just a couple hairs to the left, maybe, but still, that ultimately she seems to not be too fancy of imperialism. It's kind of like Pablo Vázquez in Uruguay, that you could say that he's not perhaps the most left person in South America, but however, at least he seems to be with the rest of the pink tide countries and then hasn't completely jumped to the right like in Argentina and Brazil. But Venezuela, the last 4 years, ever since Chavez died, with Maduro, there's been extreme attempts to sabotage. The protests have happened, violent protests, terrorist attacks being committed by the right-wing opposition. Ultimately, the economic sabotage is what seems to be causing the problems, including internal sabotage from the corporations of the country hoarding food in order to sabotage the government. That the sabotage from both ends is leading to the problems of today in Venezuela. So when you put everything in context, you start to realize that Pinochet's policies are not reflective of whatever modern day success they have in Chile right now, which again, it seems to be their success is kind of limited. I mean, I would say that they are doing pretty well, but there is definitely problems in Chile, and it's definitely not reflective on Pinochet. Pinochet there were big problems in the economy when he was in power. And it's like, in Venezuela, I don't think it's really the policies of Chavez or Maduro that are really reflective on what's going on in the last couple of years. I think it's more sabotage, internal sabotage, coup attempts, many things that are hindering on their economy. So they were doing fine under Chavez for many years, under the Chavista socialist plan. And also you can't, I don't think you can say that it was because of the prior government of Andres Perez and Caldera that led to the economic success in the 2000s, because it was shit in the 90s when they were in power. And I really believe that also until this plan into a Chavez radically reformed a lot. 1990, like there was almost instant success. Like the 2000s, a lot of economic numbers rose. However, once the United States got very interested in sabotage of Hugo Chavez, and it might have been around the time he repatriated the gold, there became extreme problems with the economy. And now those problems weren't nearly as bad as what's resulted in the last 2 years or so, where it's now extreme problems with the Venezuelan economy. And especially in 2016, 2017, we've seen the Venezuelan government fall out of favor due to the sabotage. And this is exactly what the American government wants, is that Venezuelan government falls out of favor, then they can push their pro-American guy in 2018 during the election, Capriles Verdansky, and then he'll take power and then turn Venezuela into a country just like Argentina or whatever, there's now a pro-American guy there, Marcio Macri, who is pro-American, pro-Israel, pro-Britain, totally a Western puppet. And it's the same thing now with Michael Temer. How Michael Temer, interesting to watch his government because it seems to be already collapsing just a few months in. He took power September 1st of last year, and Michael Temer's government's already fallen apart before our eyes. And it's, there's already a big corruption scandal. I think the parliament has called for an investigation, and I think this might be partially a response from the right wing of the country made to remove Temer before the election. That way, that they can run a candidate that has a chance against Lula. Because I'm going to say that because 60 of the people in the parliament voted to remove Dilma Rousseff. And I think they knew what they were doing when they brought in Temer into the government. So you're going to tell me that all of a sudden these people got a conscience and all of a sudden realized that the error of their ways. I don't really buy that. I buy more the fact that they're trying to save face, so they're going to get rid of the ugly face in the government, Temer, to replace it with someone that can actually win in 2018. And I think that's especially what done in Venezuela is they should put on an attempt, because right now that already Maduro's name has been smeared heavily by the media and by the sabotage attempts and the economic turmoil that they've had in the country. A lot of it's blamed on Maduro. There's not much Maduro can do in order to save his face at this point. I almost feel at this point they should have already went to a different candidate and tried to save the image of the party. And whether that's Díaz Cabello, whoever they pick, in order to have more of a legitimate chance of winning next year. I think it's going to be very difficult, even if they do run a different candidate, because of the fact that they waited this long to try to save face of the party. Maduro has been, there's part of, I would say that part of the problem is Maduro. I think part of it is incompetence, and I feel like Chavez would have dealt with the crisis a little bit differently. I feel like Díaz Cabello actually has the competency to try to resolve Venezuela's problems, and I think that if the people give Díaz Cabello a chance, he will fix Venezuela, and he will bring an end to this right-wing violence that's going on in the streets of Venezuela. And the whole thing that's been painted out as peaceful protesters is very wrong. These people are not peaceful protesters, definitely peaceful protesters in the right-wing opposition in Venezuela. However, a lot of these people are violent. They're being paid by foreign agencies. Similar to Syria in the early onset of the war, is that there were peaceful protesters. However, there were violent ones. And ultimately, it forced the Syrian government to react. And when the Syrian government reacted, the Syrian rebels became a force. And now you see that it's an all-out insurgency, which the Syrian rebels have committed human rights violations. They've potentially used chemical weapons. They've done unspeakable acts of cruelty to civilians, and the Syrian rebels are being backed by our government, being backed by United States dollars, and ultimately, down in Venezuela, some of these people are kind of reminiscent of the Syrian rebels, and I worry that the country might be on the brink of a civil war, and a lot of people have said that for a while, that this is the situation. This country is on the brink of a civil war. Venezuela is on the brink of a civil war. If Venezuela was to break into civil war, it goes right into the American plans, and they could potentially even intervene and try to overthrow Nicolas Maduro via an intervention. And it's destabilizing the country. It's exactly what they want. This is their agenda. This is their MO, is to destabilize. And it's to take order via chaos. This is an old, goes back to this is from the secret societies and stuff that are in the shadows of this government believe in. It's taking order via chaos. And I believe it says on our dollar or something like that. So that's pretty much what in Venezuela they would like to see. Venezuela's government right now has been hanging on pretty well despite the constant sabotage by the United States government. The fact that it's been almost daily now for almost 2 years, constant, violent protests, chaos in the streets, and the way that they've been painted on the media. is that they've been painted out to be villains and that they've been painted out to be one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. You have even the Latin media here in this country taking a very strong stance against the Venezuelan government. People like Univision, which, I find ironic is that, Trump took this very hardline stance against Univision during the campaign. Later, he probably likes that there are a strong stance against the Venezuelan government. Because we know that Trump's anti-Venezuelan, anti-Cuban, Trump's is taking a very strong approach towards South America, and it's like the opposite of the Monroe Doctrine. Is that some people compare America's imperialism in the region to the Monroe Doctrine, but the Monroe Doctrine was actually to protect Latin American countries from European imperialists, whether it was the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, whoever. The United States was to stand in solidarity with these countries when we were recently a country that had rebelled against imperialism of Europe back in 1812. And we faced it a second attempt when Britain tried to come over here and invade our country. We pushed them out again, and they tried to take back our country just 40-something years after the War of Independence. And ultimately, if you look also at the War of 1812, it was kind of an extension of the Napoleonic Wars, because in a way, the United States was a French ally, and Britain was fighting us. And it was kind of divided in early America between, politicians who were friendly to France, politicians who were friendly to Britain, and John Adams, who Treasurer Alexander Hamilton tried to establish the first central bank in the country, which he was ultimately shot by Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr eventually had to flee to France. Some people call Aaron Burr a traitor, but I think that Aaron Burr might have saved their country for a while at that point. And then Andrew Jackson, he faced 2 assassination attempts in the 1820s, 1830s when he was president, and he prevented the second central bank of America from being built. Which, despite all the other stuff, talk about Andrew Jackson, that, there's obviously the history with the Native Americans in this country and much more. I can't defend his presidency as a whole, but when it came to his policy on the banks, it definitely has to be admired. And that's what's ironic with Donald Trump, is that a man that's 100% owned by the banks, 100% doing lip service to the banks, is going to put a picture of Andrew Jackson in his Oval Office, like he's somehow comparable to Andrew Jackson. As I have to say about Andrew Jackson, he seems to have a lot more balls than Donald Trump. When it comes to the Native Americans, what he did was reprehensible. But however, when it comes to what he did in order to save our country from vulture bankers, that's definitely admirable, to say the least. And we didn't have another attempt for about 90 years until 1913 to get the Federal Reserve. And that was pushed under the eyes of Americans, and they had their guy Woodrow Wilson, who they helped bring in 1912. Is that a lot of people want to talk about how they think that this last election was rigged. Let's talk about the election that was rigged that actually mattered, which was 1912. And I think that they did different things to make Woodrow Wilson become the president. And I think that if Teddy was in second place, we might have never seen the Federal Reserve. Teddy Roosevelt, again, another man I can't really defend because of his brutal policies in different regards when it came to his foreign policy, when it came to what he did in the Spanish, or when it came to his policies overall. And I think that there was some ugly things that were committed under him in the Philippines. However, Teddy Roosevelt seemed to, I don't think that he would have stood for the banks. And that was like him and McKinley. McKinley also had the Glass to Gold Act he enacted, and I think that he was also pretty harsh towards big banking organizations and whatnot, but unfortunately, that's one man I really can't defend because of his genocide in the Philippines and during the Spanish-American War. There's very ugly, horrific policies that were implemented. Of course, there was, when it comes to the Spanish-American War, there was one silver lining, was the fact that the liberation of Cuba eventually, within 4 years of the United States holding it, Cuba finally got their independence from the Spanish Empire, but then ultimately the United States would establish a neo-colonial state in Cuba for the next 50 years until Fidel Castro to finally bring an end to it when he overthrew the Batista government in 1959. Batista was backed by the United States, was there as president twice, 1940, 1944, and 1952 and 1959, and he established a very staunch anti-communist regime, a fascist regime that killed many thousands of Cubans. At the same time, Batista also gave away a lot of the country's land to rich investors from other countries, and a huge part of the land in Cuba, Batista, was foreign owned. He essentially was a to Cuba, and was ultimately, some people try to say that, one of the common things that's said in textbooks is that Fidel Castro acted ultimately as, during his presidency, as a puppet for the Soviet government. But ultimately, Batista was the ultimate puppet, and he was a puppet for the American government. Now, Castro definitely did bow down to the Soviet Union a little more. I think Che Guevara was right in order to oppose the Castro's strong rapprochement with the Soviet government. However, I don't think that he was totally owned by the Soviet government, and I don't think that he was I don't think he went into the Soviets' ways of making some of the same errors that they did. But the Soviet cycle of government, their economy eventually stagnated, and also one major thing is there's big amount of corruption and giant bureaucracy in the Soviet government. I don't think that there was this. I don't think Cuba was ever owned by the Rothschild banks. Well, I can't say the same for the Soviet Union. Some of the ways that they behaved, especially around the time of Stalin, seemed to have the Rothschilds' fingerprints over it. Especially the fact that Stalin was the second country to recognize the formation of the State of Israel. So to me, that's kind of a big red flag, no pun intended, that the Soviet Union may have potentially been Rothschild controlled at least part of their history. Well, something tells me all of their history, from 1917 all the way up to 1991. And even maybe the only exception, one of the things that kind of tells me it might have been the whole history. This is one of the things that honestly I can't even tell. I think the formation of the country was founded by Wall Street when I look at the bankers behind the Wall Street Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin appeared to have been another asset of them, as he was ultimately a original Bolshevik. He was actually at the end really the only original Bolshevik, as he killed pretty much all the other original Bolsheviks around him. And then I would say that maybe with Khrushchev, Brezhnev, there might have been a turning point. Maybe an internal coup of some sort happened around 1953, especially with Khrushchev's denouncel of Stalin. But you look at Brezhnev during 1967 when they had the Arab-Israeli War 50 years ago. There was a huge amount of anti-Israeli propaganda in the country. Apparently, there were a lot of posters, and the Soviets had taken a pretty strong pro-Arab stance in the war, which to me would show that they're not controlled by the Zionists. However, there were other signs, with Brezhnev, and for example, the way that in the same year, October 1967, they let one of the biggest fighters against the status quo, against the New World Order, I would say, Che Guevara. They let him die in Bolivia in October 1967. They were both things that happened 50 years ago. In fact, think about it. Until the USS Liberty attack is this week, the anniversary, 50th anniversary of the USS Liberty attack. Coming up, I think that'll be on Thursday, June 8th, will be the 50th anniversary of USS Liberty attack, when Israel accidentally, and I put that in quotations, struck a United States Navy ship in the waters by Egypt, and they said it was an Egyptian boat. That's what they believed was an Egyptian boat, and ultimately they attacked the boat. They killed 34 U.S. sailors and injured 171. The boat nearly sunk. They attacked it for hours, and they claimed it was an accident. However, there was clear markings that it was an American ship, and what it appeared to have been was a false flag in order to have tried to garner enough support in the United States to get the United States behind a war and for them to back the Zionist state. I think they want them to get into a war with Egypt. I think that the United States government with L.Louis Thompson, the man was a total Zionist puppet. In the way that he talked after the USS Liberty attack, he said that I don't care if every one of those men drowns, I don't want to embarrass Israel. That's very shocking to hear that the American president talked that way about our own servicemen, but that's the way he did. It was definitely a major lie was told about that. And you know how the way they covered it up. We don't get taught about it. It's not taught about in our textbooks. You should that be mentioned somewhere. It's like, just a fun fact about Israel. Somebody. But the thing is that there's nobody that questions Israel. Israel is untouchable. And Democrats and Republicans, no one actually brings legitimate questions about Israel. If you bring even a small question about Israel, they call you an anti-Semite. They call you unpatriotic to America because somehow patriotism to that country equates to patriotism to this country. And when our interests are totally different. We give $38 billion of our tax money over there, and they still want more. They only have 6 million people. And ultimately, we give $5 billion annually. That's like a flat rate. That's just what we give. And then there's all these bonuses that we give for no good reason. And what do we get out of this relationship with Israel? Nothing. Is that some of the libertarians I've seen have actually brought up this question and, say that we need to cut foreign aid to all countries. One of the telltale signs to me that was Rand Paul, however, that Rand Paul might not have been the real deal, is when he talked about that we need to get rid of aid to Palestine. And he was talking about Palestine directly. And he said that we still had a role of our United States military of protecting Israel. There's no role that the United States military should take in protecting Israel. It should only be about protecting our own country, and the soldiers should be back home. In my opinion, it should be a defensive force, not an offensive force looking for more wars in different countries to get involved in. At one point during the Obama regime, we were under 7 wars, and Donald Trump continuing this policy of war. Really, when you think about Woodrow Wilson, when the Federal Reserve was created and the Rothschilds had control of America, they were able to get us into our first unnecessary war that we were in, which was the World War I. We had no part in World War I. It was a European war between the Central Powers and the Allies over there, and we had no role in it. But however, they faked the Zimmerman telegram, I believe it was fake, and said that Germany was trying to get Mexico to attack us. They also tried to, it almost goes along to the lie of the extent of the idea of hack the election. So like I said, that they hacked, they would put something like Ron Paul or non-interventionalist in, or Ron interventionalist like Trump. They indicated that, even though they might have said the contrary, they still indicated that Putin would have never put this guy in. And Vladimir Putin, he's pretty much laughed off the accusation that he hacked the election, and I think rightfully so. But it seems like more and more this man is being vilified in the media. And they've tried to vilify him as a crossbred of a Soviet dictator and a czar put into one. Is at the same time, while being a communist or an authoritarian, they've also tried to say that this man is a religious extremist of some sort and a heavy right-wing conservative. But ultimately, when it comes to social policies, I actually think that he's pretty moderate. And when it comes to the freedom of the country, I believe they're way more free than the United States. And they have a lot bigger variety that they can pick from their elections. I mean, look at the 4 different parties. It represents the 4 quadrants of the political spectrum. Obviously, you have like you have the LDRS, Zhirinovsky's party, in like the upper right. You have in the upper left quadrant, you have the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. In the lower right quadrant, you have, I would say, probably United Russia fits in there. Barely, though. And then in the lower left quadrant, you have the Just Russia party. And then you have all these other parties that pick up a lot. So Russia, people forget that there's like different, the factions in the party are much more diverse than the factions you find in the American Party. You might find like libertarians is not really a libertarian faction for the Republican Party. It's a meaningless faction inside of our parties, but there they have the Agrarian Socialist Party joined United Russia. You have like right-wing conservatives are in United Russia, but I wouldn't say Putin really belongs to that side of the party. I really think that Putin is really just the center that the party revolves around. And then you have like more of your kind of liberal left parts of the party, like Medvedev, and then you have your more socialist parts of the party. You have all the way back to for example, Just Russia backs, and they're like a democratic socialist party. They back Medvedev. And then you have like a little bit even more radical than that. You have almost you have like actual socialists that are in the party in there as well. It's a big, with a general feeling of social conservatism all around the party. That seems to be one of the major things that they want to separate themselves from the rest of Europe. Want to be like the rest of Europe, where it seems that they've lost a lot of the moral compass and a lot of the traditional family values are being left in Europe. Now Russia seems to want to hold on to that. And it's like a very traditional society in many ways. The fact that 35% of the country is still religious and still Christian, and the Orthodox Christian has such a deep roots in tradition. The Orthodox Church, with the patriarch, still has a lot of influence in the country. And what comes to Vladimir Putin is that Putin is not any type of extremist. He might be a religious man, however, he does not want to push religious extremist ideas down people's throats. And actually, let's look at another thing. Yes. Another thing is about the Russian society, or the Russian, when it came to the bill. Remember the so-called anti-gay bill that was passed in 2014. Is that people made a big uproar about that, and I remember they were going to boycott. They said that they were practicing extreme homophobia and stuff like that. Which also, what it did, one thing is that banned gay parades, which there was different reasons for this. In Russia, they have a major split between the right-wing extremists in the country that belong to really a political part of the country that are not affiliated with the Russian government, but these right-wing extremists versus, there was a lot of these gay protesters. A lot of times it caused the police to go out there, and rather than dealing with that, they just decided to bring it into it. Okay, another reason is because a lot of times these gay parades were much more provocative than maybe what we'll see an American gay parade, so they decided that see this anymore. And another reason is, from my word, is that they're provocateurs from our countries who are going there, using this as a political, not about gay rights, but using it as a political tool in order to demonstrate against Putin. And another thing that the bill said was against pedophilia, which I'm guessing that this might have been a reaction to relaxations on the laws in Europe, which Russia wants no part of. So Russia, I think in 2014, and it seems like a lot of stuff that Russia does seems just be pragmatic. And that's one thing that's almost kind of hard to define the ideology of the country, that they do some sort of mix of right and left. But I would say that ultimately that there is a general feeling that this is an anti-globalist regime. I guess you could say it's an anti-fascist regime, because they're opposing the major push of fascism, which is Washington, D.C. in today. However, I would say they're not like Antifa. When people think of anti-fascist, Antifa comes to mind. Antifa, it seems to become a group of, definitely there's elements of the group that are being paid by certain people to make a divide in this country. And I think that the same people that pay a lot of these provocateurs in some segments of Antifa, definitely in also Black Lives Matter, just a few of these people that are there to splinter up that movement and just to splinter up the activist community and the country as a whole. The same people that are funding that are funding the disruptions in Venezuela, funding the right-wing protesters. You have people like Soros, who's a major pusher of the concept of regime change. And Soros also, one of the guys that he targeted recently, Viktor Orban, from his own country. He said he's creating a mafia state. The real reason that he was mad about Viktor Orban is because that's the fact that he's made a close relationship with Putin and that he's removed the Rothschild. There's definitely some flaws with Viktor Orban, but I would say that the way that he's handled the refugee crisis seems to be a little harsh. However, it does come to mind, why is Europe taking in millions of refugees when ultimately the countries that destroyed these countries in the Middle East, why isn't Israel taking in hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of refugees? Why isn't the United States not taking in this huge amount of refugees? And ultimately, when it comes to the two countries that were attacking the Middle East heavily last year, some of these countries had very little role in the destruction of the Middle East, but yet are taking in a huge brunt of the refugees, including Germany. France had a pretty large role in the destruction of the Middle East, but not nearly the role that the United States and Israel have. But unfortunately, they've had to take in like 2 million refugees recently, and you have other countries that the refugees have been taken in. Of course, I think there seems to be a hysteria against the refugees. There's all this talk that the few criminals that came about with refugees have been really pushed for stories over and over again, trying to create hysteria. And I think it's part of the divide and conquer thing again. It's that the refugees are very polarizing. It's either people go very far to defend them, or it seems like people go very far to hate them. I seem to take a little bit of an approach in the middle, and I realize that, I feel bad for these people that are being forced out of their countries. However, I do realize that there's potential problems of culture clash, and I do realize that there's potential, I realize the extreme hypocrisy in the policy is that the United States can bomb these countries, however, they don't have to take in virtually any refugees, and these countries that didn't even bomb anyone, some of these small European countries are taking in refugees. Why did they have to take the burden? Why is it them? Why isn't the United States? Why isn't Israel? Israel is a big question. Why isn't them? Well, why isn't Israel also had a big part of destroying the Middle East? Also, if they went to their country, there might be less of a culture clash, I believe, as these people are also coming from more traditional Muslim societies, come to the liberal Europe. There's definitely going to be a huge culture clash. It's very different cultures. That's my question. Why Saudi Arabia taking them in? Saudi Arabia lists. How much does the royal family have in their net worth? The royal family has what? $1.3 trillion that their net worth is. Why aren't they taking in the refugees? That's my question. And by the way, we're about an hour into the show right now. So if anyone wants to call in, the call number is 845-277-9223. 845-277-9223. Here at the one and only Voice of Rebellion Radio with your host, Chris J. Here, June 3rd, live. It is around noon Eastern Time. And if you're listening to the replay for this, this will be replaying at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So it's probably around 10 p.m. Eastern Time right now on the replay. Or if you're listening to it on YouTube, I thank all of you for listening to this edition of Voice of Rebellion Radio. Our home station, UCY.TV, broadcasting on Stable Radio right now, live. This is Chris J. And talk about pretty much as a mix of things today. But in Syria, what's sad about this refugee crisis is that a lot of these people have been displaced from their homes twice. Is that, for example, some of the people that left Iraq, they got bombed in Syria and have went to Europe, because a lot of those people came from after the Iraqi invasion. After the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, they left Iraq. In 2003, they came to Syria, and then in Syria they got bombed in 2011 to 2017. Now we have these people have been displaced twice from their homes. It's that I think Americans came a picture with, and that's why at the same time I'm not going to take the very hardline stance that some of these people seem to just take a stance of fuck them, fuck the refugees, whatever. No, so when it comes to Syrian refugees, they definitely deserve a new home, a new life, because they didn't do anything to deserve it. However, one of the things that also does worry about me is the idea that some of these people might not be refugees, and posing as refugees from other countries, and they're purely just migrants from countries. A different story. From Egypt or whatever. If they come from Libya, they're refugees as well. Because Libya, their country's been practically torn apart by terrorism after the fall of Gaddafi, and what's been happening in Europe the last few years kind of seems reminiscent of what Gaddafi said before he's overthrown. Some use of the time for the power vacuum. Sorry about that, guys. Again, I think I fell off there again. I think I figured out the problem. We should be fine. But continuing on with this show is talk about what happened, when it comes to the and it's not somebody we'll call perfect, but there was definitely when I think to his overall governance in the country, that he pushed Libya from a very poor third world country into the modern times practically. And I think it's something to be admired for sure. And I think that the way, when it came to his man-made river projects, when it came to the different things he did for the country, and also when you look at the social programs that he had for the country, it was very impressive. They had they had free electricity, they nationalized a lot of the things in the country, and it worked out very well for the country. I mean, the people that say that nationalization does not lead to a good economy, I think we'll look at what Libya was like the richest country in Africa at one point. And, some people think that was just Gaddafi was able to do this based on luck or whatever, based on the situation. But, there's been countries with, for example, Libya still had a giant oil reserve for their key migrants, and not nearly the prosperity that we had. It was up there, not nearly as built up in the West, their rate here that made it difficult for this, but for us, it's controlled by design. And that's why they overthrew him on December 1st, 1999. And Gaddafi, I know they're 42 years, they have a long time to make huge changes to the country. But he also removed the Rothschild Bank from the country, which did a huge part in Libya. Was a very nice country living until the Civil War in 2011. And now, you see the last few years, it's probably warlords controlling one part of the country. There's some parts that are safer than others, but it's no fun. Two governments really are fighting over each other. ISIS is in the mix. They were smaller. And then you have the Gaddafi who might be able to bring in to might be able to bring an end to this war, hopefully. However, I don't know if I was. Dang, I now realize I've been on 3 minutes or whatever. I might not have been picking that up. It might have been all on that might have been all muffled because I wasn't even on speakerphone. I disconnected like twice there, and I didn't realize. Luckily, I looked up on my phone and I realized I was on speaker. But resuming with the show is when it came to with Libya, what was talked about while what might not have been picked up was talked about Libya I was talking about the resistance in the country currently to the current two governments, Gaddafi, if they're fighting in the mix too. They've been largely ignored by a lot of the media, including a lot of the alternative media seems to have ignored them. But I saw Sputnik covered it. I think talk about the they've been revolving around one general, which I'm going to look up. What's the general's name that they've been fighting around in southwest Libya? There's this is where the Gaddafi's loyalists, I guess, are kind of centered. And if Gaddafi was to retake power of the country, I think that he could definitely bring order to the country, whether what Gaddafi's family member was, or maybe perhaps one of the Gaddafi loyalists that are fighting. As you know, he was able to quell terrorism in this country for how many years? And how many years were they able to keep terrorism down under Assad until the Civil War broke out? It's until it was imported to their countries that they had problems. And you look at ultimately the biggest exporter of terrorists in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, a few other countries. And, you know, when it comes to the clerics, the ideology of terrorism is pretty much exported from Saudi Arabia via Wahhabism. Wahhabism, which is pretty much a perversion of Islam. And what I mean by that is not that it spawns off of Islam. It's a twisting. It's a tainted version of Islam that pretty much tells them to kill and to use brutality to obtain their means of political influence and whatnot. It is not what the original Quran reflects. It's similar to, like, I mean, I would say the Wahhabism is to Islam is what the KKK or something is to Christianity. Is that ultimately KKK and hate groups like that are not Christianity. The Wahhabist leadership in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family have a $1.3 trillion have been a major part in the financing terrorism throughout the Middle East. And, you know, I think that they have detracted from the United States government and the Israeli government when it comes to 9/11 by trying to say that the Saudis were responsible for 9/11, which is not really true. The Saudis did have a role in the 9/11 attacks, but I think that they had a small role in the 9/11 attacks. I think the Saudis, a minor player in 9/11, and you know, right now there seems to be the talk, and that might even become the new mainstream narrative, is that Saudis did 9/11. However, it seems to be blocked. You know, it's like Obama. It started surfacing in 2016, and Obama vetoed a bill or whatever about allowing 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia, and now Donald Trump, even though he was talking about during his campaign that Saudi Arabia might have did 9/11, now he's over there dancing with the Saudis. The Saudis are a major part of the New World Order, so I feel like that the United States will never take a strict stance against the Saudis. And ultimately, when it comes to unveiling the truth about 9/11, I think it's going to be up to the alternative media that just keep pushing it out there, keep pushing it out there until the evidence is irrefutable and people finally start accepting it. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of people never accept it just because of the cognitive dissonance that revolves around the whole situation. And part of that is believing the narrative of, you know, the bad guys are the good guys. We're the good guys and we're fighting the bad guys, the terrorists. Ultimately, though, the bad guys are being financed by what they thought were the good guys, and it's really just a bunch of bad guys. Terrorists, the United States government, Israel's government, and that's a major one. The people believe that the Israeli government is actually the Israeli government of the Bible. They believe it's the kingdom of Israel, and these people are the Israelites. However, these are the Israelis. So there's a difference. The Israelis, these people are descendants of the Khazarians that converted in Europe. These people are Europeans that converted to Judaism around the year 800. People will blame anti-Semitism, stuff like that, for the reason why a lot of the world doesn't like Israel. But ultimately, what Israel does, the way that they've stolen the land from the Palestinians, their own actions is what makes people don't like Israel. And for me, that's how it's very hard to even see it when it comes to the only way I could see the defense of Israel is from a pure perspective of being not informed. People that are not informed will believe that the oppressors are the oppressed and the oppressed are the oppressors. And in this situation, believing that the Palestinians are the oppressors while the Israelis are the oppressed, that's the complete flipping of the truth. It's not a reality. It's just completely erroneous. And I can't find that article from earlier to talk about the Gaddafi loyalists. Apparently Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, which is Gaddafi's son, he's out of jail now. He was actually sentenced to death at one point, but somehow found his freedom. And, at one point he was considered like the prime minister of Libya. However, I kind of find it hard to trust Saif al-Islam. I feel like, I think he was friends with, from what I read, one of Rothschild or something like that, showed up to his birthday party. And Tony Blair kind of liked them. I don't know exactly what's that whole deal, whether that's just them maybe they're trying to suck up to him or whatever. There's also Hannibal Gaddafi. He's still alive. He was a general or something, I think, in the Navy under Gaddafi. There's, let's see, Khamis, Mohammed Gaddafi. They have quite a few children, actually. There's Aisha Gaddafi. I don't know how many of them are still. I only think 3 of them are still alive. I think, I know one of them became like a soccer player. One of Gaddafi's children was a soccer player. But then his career wasn't too successful. But I think he actually made it to like a European team. Well, I found this story was that apparently Gaddafi loyalists rescued Americans in Benghazi, supposedly. Americans rescued from the facility in Benghazi were saved by a Gaddafi loyalist, not the Libyan government or the militia group contractually obligated to provide security. The final report from the House Select Committee on Benghazi reveals. After lethal mortar attacks, the special operator in Benghazi testified that we decided the situation we had as untenable to stay at the compound. We didn't have enough shooters, and there were too many wounded. And we were definitely going to lose our State Department wounded if we had stayed there much longer. Americans in the annex, though, did not have the security vehicles and gun trucks necessary to evacuate to the airport in Benghazi, and help would eventually arrive. The forces that arrived at the annex shortly after the mortar attacks were able to transport all the State Department and CIA personnel safely to the airport. The forces known as the Libyan government military intelligence arrived with 50 heavily armored security vehicles, the Select Committee's report says. The Libyan military intelligence was not part of the Libyan government that the Obama administration supported. Neither was a component of the February 17 Martyrs Brigade recommended by the Libyan government contractually obligated to provide security to the mission compound. The report also says that the February 17 Martyrs Brigade militia, which provided interior armed security at the Benghazi mission compound, informed the diplomatic security agents 2 days before the ambassador was scheduled to arrive it would no longer provide off-compound security. Instead, the Libyan military intelligence, whom the CIA did not even know existed until the night of the attacks, were comprised of former military officers under the Gaddafi regime who had gone to hiding in fear of being assassinated and wanted to keep their presence in Benghazi as quiet as possible so as not to attention from militia in control of Benghazi, the report later notes. It continues to say, in other words, some of the very individuals the United States had helped remove from power during the Libyan government were the only Libyans that came to the assistance of the United States on the night of the Benghazi attacks. American operatives on the ground only found out about the Libyan military intelligence group after a national police officer described as the capabilities as next to helpless. It was also his group, not groups previously given credit by previous investigations that came to the rescue of the Americans in the early morning hours, likely saving dozens of lives as a result, the Select Committee concluded. That's interesting. I wonder, if the living José María came back, it would be interesting what would be the United States government's stance on that. And I feel like they were going to take a pretty hostile stance. I don't think that that's going to be a very supportive stance that the United States government would take, because you see that they back terrorism all across the Middle East, and they seem to oppose every secular Arab state. If they were to come back, the United States are going to oppose them. And it'll also be interesting how like some of their neighbors are going to react. I think that Syria is going to react well, Iran is going to react well. I wonder how Saudi Arabia is going to react. I wonder how Turkey is going to react. Also, I think that we'll talk about Turkey. I think Erdogan, I believe he arrested an NBA player's father last night or something like that, which Erdogan has been named by that NBA player as the Hitler of his country. Erdogan, to me, is a clown, and he sees himself as being a new sultan when he's not even the new. This man, he doesn't have really even true power in his own country. There's still a lot of people that oppose them. There's been protests for a few years now. It's funny to talk about the Venezuela protests all the time, but they don't talk about the Turkey protests that have been going on for a while. And the fact is that it resulted in nearly a coup last year. However, the coup was done by likely another pro-American source itself, with Gulen nearly took power of the country, and there was the whole military uprising. Thousands of people were arrested afterwards. It was a big deal. I remember it was like July of last year. They had a coup attempt. Now I think that there's not going to be. I don't think there's going to be any coup attempt for a while, and I think that Erdogan's going to stay in power for a while. He had the referendum that would expand his powers, and it passed. So now the man has pretty much unlimited power in Turkey, but ultimately he's just a puppet of the big bankers. Erdogan is a very vital piece of NATO, as he is in his position that he's in. And it reminds me, way back when the United States put missiles in Turkey in order to pressure the Soviet Union. Well, Erdogan kind of puts a little bit of pressure on Russia. The Middle East right now as a whole has become kind of like a proxy stage for potential showdown sometime in the future between Russia and the United States. So I think that Iran and the United States is probably going to be the next war. And I think this is going to be World War III, Iran versus the United States, because of the fact that the entire Middle East will be engulfed in flames if Iran and the United States get into a direct war with each other. It's going to be Syria is going to get involved. Israel's going to get involved with the United States. It's going to be ugly. And I think there's going to be support from other countries, but I don't think that Russia is going to join in the war. Just because they've shown a lot of restraint when it comes to Ukraine, I think that a war with Iran won't be enough to draw Russia in. They don't want an apocalyptic war over that. Unless Russia is directly attacked, I don't think that Russia would attack the United States. Putin has shown a lot of restraint in the last few years with some of the tensions that have arisen under his presidency. And under his presidency, there's been big problems nearby. Georgia, there's been in Georgia, there's been the war that happened there in 2008. There's been there's been what happened, the North Korea standoff. There's been the Syrian civil war. There's been problems over here in this hemisphere with Venezuela, and many other problems throughout there's been also the Ukraine situation broke out. There's Euromaidan, which was a coup by the United States to overthrow Yankovic and put in a fascist into Kiev. And now you see what the kind of things that the government there in Kiev is doing to the ethnic Russians of the country. It's despicable. During his presidency, there's been a lot of problems. It's not been easy for Putin. It's not been easy for anyone in Russia, and I think that eventually, I don't know. Honestly, I think that Putin might be getting tired of it. I think that why he's waiting so long to announce his whether he's going to run for a fourth term or not is because of this. Because Putin is now going into June of 2017. The election's like 9 months away, which ultimately the elections is pretty much a passing of power to the next generation if he doesn't run. Because it's not like I don't think United Russia is going to lose anyone. There's no serious challenger in the Russian field. I mean, look at it. It's like, yeah, you have Zyuganov would be their second best candidate. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation cannot win an election. They don't have nearly support, and they have a few remote, like oblasts where they actually have some power. But besides, like way out in Siberia, their voting base is pretty small, and a lot of it relies on older people. It's an older people's party that remember what they believe is the glory days of the Soviet Union, so they want those back. Which, to go back, last time that really the Soviet Union was at a heightened state was prior to the 1970s. So it was about 40 years ago. To remember it any bit, we have to be 55 at least. Because once the 80s hit, the country started, there became some serious problems with the Soviet-Afghan war. There was 3 leaders died in 3 years, and then the opening up of the country led to a lot of their territory being lost, and then what happened later, the wild 90s. But during the 70s, I guess you could say that it wasn't as bad. Though, again, like I said before, is that I can't say for sure that the Soviet Union wasn't controlled for the entire time by the bankers. And I think that definitely at the beginning, definitely in Stalin, that the Soviet Union was controlled by big banks. As I think that Wall Street ultimately was the one that funded the Bolshevik Revolution, in my opinion. You look at what they might have been trying to do was to limit the Russian Empire's influence, cause a massive disruption in the country, and then ultimately the Tsar, I think, was afraid of his power. And though I know one thing is that, there's not too many supporters really of the monarchy in Russia today. At least not politically. Well, I think one of the people is Zhirinovsky, and apparently, I don't know, I heard they made some comments about Rasputin or whatever to the British. He was like, hey, you guys go Rasputin, which was a popular conspiracy theory that Rasputin was killed by the British. Rasputin was one of the most powerful people in Russia before his death. He was actually a pretty powerful advisor. There was a lot of, theories about Rasputin or whatever. Some people think that Rasputin was demonically possessed. Some people believe Rasputin was actually a healer of great nature. I don't believe really too much into that he was a man of any real special powers. I think that he just was maybe a good showman. It's a pretty peculiar story about how a illiterate man from the mountains of Russia became one of the most powerful people in the Russian Empire, and he actually died about a year prior to the fall of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire fell apart in February of 1917, and then in October of 1917, the Soviets took power. The country went communist. So we're actually near the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Soviet Union becoming a country. Well, the Soviet Union didn't become an entity until 1922, but Soviet Russia became a thing in October 1917. And the next 74 years, there would be a lot of history would take place. The Great Patriotic War. You would have the Cold War. But there was a lot of struggle for sure. There was a lot of people like to romanticize the Soviet Union and try to make it seem like it was much better times than today. But Russia, and that should be what's should be focused on, not on the imperial period, not on the Soviet Union. Be focused on this new period that's existed since 1999 when Putin took power. This new period that's been ushered in for Russia. It's this new period that they've entered, which is a time of better economic prosperity. The military's being re-strengthened in the country again, and it looks pretty bright for Russia in the future. There's been some roadblocks, but I think that despite the naysayers in the West, Putin's done a pretty good job, and there's a reason why he has like 80% approval rating. He's got 80% approval rating, Assad's got 70% of approval rating, but these Western leaders, look at Trump, what, he's got 21% approval rating, but yet Americans feel like they can talk about how our leader is much better than these people's leaders. Trump's approval rating, I mean, it was pretty low to begin with. I mean, it was one of the few presidents that I think had within like a week, he already was down to like 40, 60. Like, only 40% of the people approved of him. And now after his first international trip and after a few months in the presidency, people seem to be pretty irritated. And I think people are pretty irritated that it's more the same. That we have another neocon in the White House. And, it goes back to like things like the Project for a New American Century. They also are part of the reason why we'll never have a president that actually makes any real change. We have these big forces that prevent that from happening. And, we have the Bilderberg Committee. That's the huge one. The Bilderberg Committee, the Council of Foreign Relations, other big organizations that ultimately prevent real changes in foreign policy from happening. By the way, if anyone wants to call in, number is going to be 845-277-9223, 845-977-2223, start over, 845-277-9223. You're at Voice of Gun Radio at UCY.TV. By the way, this is, if you're listening to this later, then don't try to call in if it's Sunday night. This is if you're listening right now, Saturday early afternoon, on the live podcast. If you're listening Sunday night, then you probably want to then just listen. And I don't really get callers too much on the UCY .TV. We're going to go live there. It's been a while, actually, since I can think the last time I had a caller. They're pretty rare, and I like having callers. I like when people actually contribute to the show, and then, people participate and we have a good discussion going. I remember some shows getting 4 or 5 callers in a show. Those are real nice to have, so you start talking about the topic, somebody calls in, contributes, may go to different topics, someone calls in, contributes, and you go on and on and on. And, talk about going back to about Syria and what's been going on there for the last 6 years now, is that, this is a tragedy almost to the level of something like what happened during the Russian Civil War or something. And, in the Russian Civil War, they had 4 million were killed, but it was afterwards where some of the real tragedies happened. But in Syria, they've lost hundreds of thousands of people. And United States regime change, Israeli regime change, and ultimately the New World Order, trying to remove Assad from power because of his opposition to the New World Order, is the real reason why this is happening. And people need to learn the truth about what's going on in Syria. They need to learn the truth about central banking and how toxic central banking is for the world. When people understand how toxic central banking is for the world, then maybe perhaps we can have some real changes. And when people stand up to the Fed, we'll have some real changes. Is that people thought the Ron Paul supporters were kooky for standing up to the Fed. However, the Ron Paul supporters now finally are starting to get vindicated, as a few years later, they don't look as kooky anymore, as we've seen the results of the Fed, and we've had another bubble burst about 10 years ago, and it seems that another bubble could burst now. A lot of economists are predicting that within a few years we'll have another major recession, maybe even a economic dollar collapse. And it seems to be coming with the petrodollar no longer being traded for oil, or no longer the main dollar being traded for oil. We might have some serious problems. And that's why I suggest anyone that's looking to invest in something, that has the money to invest in something, to look into gold. I think that's the most important thing you can invest in, because gold never really loses its value. 2,000 years go by, and gold still pays for pretty much the same stuff. But the dollar is so fragile at this point. We've seen what happens, with economic wars and stuff like that, what happened with Zimbabwe. That was the result of an economic sabotage. But you see how fragile currency can be. And you saw what happened there, is that the dollar totally collapsed. The Zim dollar, it took like 100 trillion Zim dollars in order to pay for food. Then ultimately they ended up, they were successful in literally taking their currency out of commission. Now they have to use the Chinese yuan. But Robert Mugabe, a lot of people they say that his economic policies are responsible for that. It's similar to like blaming Venezuela's economic policies for the current problems and the current turmoil in the country. But in reality, it's not that. Venezuela and Zimbabwe have been targeted by economic war, and the economic war could be in many ways more destructive than actual war. It's a very powerful tool that the elite can use, and that's the thing. The part of the problem of living in this modern society where everything's on numbers and everything, it seems that to initiate on economic war, things are a little bit easier. But they also did this back in the 1920s with Germany, and they at one point their money was worth 4.3 Deutschmarks to a dollar. There was 4.3 trillion Deutschmarks to a dollar 3 years later. They were using it to start fires because their money was that worthless. Germany suffered the full brunt of an economic war in the 1920s, and it led to the uprising of the populist movements, which ultimately one of them was Nazi Germany, as people felt that they could bring the solution to the country. And it is actually true that their economy did recover for a short time, but the price that they eventually got into World War, and ultimately a lot of people were exterminated. You look at who was the back of Nazi Germany. It was bankers, Wall Street. Just like the Bolshevik Revolution, just like the United States government, you see Wall Street, big bankers, they're there. That's the underlying theme, is that you see central banking there for a lot of these calamities. And when it comes to Syria, there's a central banking interest. When you look at Iraq, there was a central banking interest. When you look into Venezuela, there's a central banking interest. And also you look at the media and their role in making these lies in order to garner enough support for these drastic measures to be taken. If they ever justify an invasion against Venezuela, it's going to be partially because the media told you that people are starving and this is for the good of their own people. However, it's kind of being exaggerated how bad the situation in Venezuela is. Is that it's not as bad as being shown on the TV. They try to say that everyone's starving, no one can afford food. There's definitely shortages. There's definitely people that are going hungry. However, there are definitely some people are still definitely getting food, and also there's a lot of people that are still protesting on behalf of the Venezuelan government, and there's also a lot of people protesting against. But you see that some of those so-called peaceful protesters on the right are not peaceful. They're violent, and they're striking at they're attacking the Venezuelan government, attacking the Venezuelan people, and there's reports they're even attacking hospitals and stuff like that. This is not peaceful. This is not a revolution, really. This is imported thugs from other places in order to do regime change. Venezuela, in many ways, got some parallels to Syria. It's got some parallels to Ukraine. I think it's more comparable to Ukraine, because Ukraine, it was similar. They had violent riots pretty much to the point that Yankovic stepped down, and they brought about a fascist government to take its place. Is that if these protests continue and the riots continue and the current government steps down, fascists will take place. Kirill Speransky will take place. And what he is a younger face of the same bullshit that the party was back in the 90s, the 80s, the fascists that were in control then, is that ultimately some of these people in that party, in the MUD, are actually leftovers of that dictatorship from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And it really wasn't that long ago when you think about it. That's why there could be still leftovers of that fascist dictatorship. It's not even like these people are inspired. Some of these people are literally, like Ramos Ayub, I believe, who was in their parliament back in the 90s. He's back now as the leader of the party of the opposition. And Capriles Verdansk is the face that they'll run the election. Ayub is 75, so that's why they won't run him. But Capriles Verdansk, they can run, and he's the 45 young poster boy for American imperialism. But Capriles Verdansk also is disliked by a lot of the population. I feel like he might also be his own worst nightmare, and that in the end, that a populist left candidate like Cabello might be able to just cream him in the election. I hope that's why they pick him. However, if they go with Maduro, who's not really a populist, I would say, is that he doesn't have the charisma that Chavez has. If Maduro runs again, they probably lose. That's why I think they need to pull out Maduro, put in somebody else in his place to run in 2018. And, I've heard rumors that they were going to, make the moves in the party 2 years ago. That's the problem, is that Maduro might be being stubborn, doesn't want to step down. However, ultimately is that this what might seem as an admission to defeat there is a lot better than the party falling apart and the fascists taking over in 2018 and the country going to Brazil or Argentina. And Argentina might be going right in the same direction they were in 2001 when the neoliberal government caused the banking run and the banks were frozen in 2001, or it might be going the same direction of what Temer right now in Brazil was, just a total litany of corruption. And, Paraguay ain't looking too good either. These are all countries that switched governments. They went from left-wing governments to right-wing pro-American governments, and they've had pretty bad results. Peru, I haven't heard too much yet, actually, but they didn't go from a drastic switch, especially like Argentina. Went from a pretty anti-American government. They were also very strongly anti-Zionist to a definitely pro-Zionist right-wing regime. There's definitely going to be some problems there with the Macri government if he stays there much longer. He's been there about a year and a half. Peru, however, went from center-left to a right-wing Kaczynski, who is a man that has a lot of ties to America and a lot of ties, it seems like, everywhere else but Peru. It was him versus the daughter of a former fascist dictator, Alberto Fujimori. It was Keiko Fujimori. However, Keiko Fujimori didn't win. It was a total shit show. They had one good left-wing candidate, but she lost in the first round, Mendoza. This was last year the election went down between these two. I think it was April 10th was the first round last year, then June. Around this time, about a year ago, we had the second round, and that's where Kaczynski prevailed. Now Kaczynski is the president of Peru. And there's one more country, so that's 5 countries now that are no longer part of Pink Tide in South America. They have Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia. Colombia was never part of Pink Tide. It's actually the only country in South America that never joined this socialist surge in South America. People like to say, well, socialism as a whole has failed in Latin America. Well, look at Bolivia. You don't hear too many complaints about Bolivia, and there's actually been a lot of good that's been done in the country. A lot of progress has been made there. Argentina did very well during the Kirchner years, and Brazil did very well until I think there was some attempts at sabotage during the years of Dilma and prior to that Lula. And that's why I think if Lula wins again, I think Lula's going to win in 2018. That's the thing, is that I think there's going to be a massive rollback of this right-wing resurgence in South America, because they realize the mistakes they're made is that they're going to remove them before they get removed, before the dissidents get removed, before the dissidents get hauled off in black vans, like what happened in Pinochet's Chile. And, I don't know why people are so quick to want to back Pinochet on the internet. And people, they say their little smart remarks like, oh, how would you like a free helicopter ride? That kind of stuff. It's really just ugly. The whole those people they're like, oh yeah, Pinochet's free helicopter rides is or how, and then people say, like throwing people out of helicopters is wrong, but commies aren't people, so it's right or whatever. Defending what happened under a tyrannical fascist regime while you claim yourself to be a libertarian is very ironic, but it's very sad at the same time. And a lot of these people, I don't think you can really claim to be a libertarian. Like, the alt-right, they have their own ideology. It doesn't even really belong into fascism itself either. That's the weird thing about it. It's like a totally independent ideology that it's hard to pin what exactly it is. No, it's weird though how also the media was like kind of like for a while it was kind of like trying to demonize it, and then at the same time though they stand by some really ultimately what some of the things the alt-right supports the media will stand for, and that's for example like regime change in these certain countries, and this whole idea of this false patriotism that's being pushed, not the real patriotism. These people, like alt-right people, claim to be nationalists, but I wouldn't say they're nationalists. They're more like nationalists in the sense of you're Wilders or whatever. It's just they're nationalists in the sense of hating other people, but I think nationalism is about caring about your own people and, ultimately facing the real threats of your country, which are banks, corporations, that kind of thing. And that's why I think Marine Le Pen might have been a real nationalist. That's why they didn't let her win her election in earlier this month or last month. Marine Le Pen ultimately lost the election, and now Macron's there, and Macron and Putin met, and it was kind of awkward. Macron was trying to say the line of that Putin interfered with their election. That seems to be a line now of all Western leaders, is that Putin was trying to interfere with their country somehow. But they've continued it. They're still saying that Putin was trying to interfere with the election here in the United States. And how many months later has it been? And they're still continuing with this. And this whole thing was supposed Russiagate, and it's not a real thing. There's no reason why Vladimir Putin would have interfered with the election. Why would Vladimir Putin deal with a rigged election? It's rigged. America's elections are a joke. Right around this time of the year, the Bilderberg Committee meets, and for people who are not familiar with the Bilderberg Committee, it's a giant think tank where like some of the most powerful people from around the world, big corporate leaders, presidents, they meet in a secretive place. They change like every year, and it's rumored what to discuss. But some people say they're discussing world domination, and that's kind of what I think to discuss. I think they're discussing plans towards the new world order, what they're going to do the next year, and it's very little talked about. But the Bilderberg Committee, it's very secretive. You can't even get that close to it. I remember a few years ago they had in Canada. And I remember the Alex Jones and Mark Dice would do like their little stunts or whatever where they go with a microphone into the Bilderberg Committee. But I don't think that Mark Dice or Alex Jones are actually the real deal, because how I've seen that they went totally on board of the Trump bandwagon. Alex Jones, he went really with the Trump bandwagon. And Mark Dice had just pretty much turned himself into like a normal conservative media analyst, and that's what he even says he wants to be called now. He wants to be called a media analyst. And, he used to kind of embrace more of the conspiracy theorists, which I can see why people don't like the term conspiracy theorist, because it's a derogatory term, but conspiracy realist, or he doesn't really embrace that whole thing anymore. He seems to talk more just bad-mouthing liberals of the country, and some of them rightfully so, but at the same time, it seems to be one-sided and not showing off the bozos on both sides of the political spectrum, and he's fallen right into the two-party paradigm. It's kind of disappointing to watch Mark Dice and Alex Jones pretty much sell out to the mainstream, and I don't know if they were ever real. To me, I only really like conspiracy theorists that are like kind of mainstream that I like would be Jesse Ventura. I like Jesse Ventura because of the fact of, the way he talks seems to actually be of important things, and he doesn't fall into the two-party paradigm. listen to Alex Jones and Mark Dice, eventually both did. By the way, if anyone wants to call in, last 10 minutes here is 12:50 Eastern Time. The people who are listening, the live broadcast, it should be around 10:50, depending on the editing. But it's 845-277-9223, 845-277-9223. Depending on the editing, it should be around 10:50 Eastern Time on the live broadcast on Sunday. There might be some moments edited out because of the little technical difficulties we had around the top of the hour. But I think we had a pretty good show today. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. And if you haven't checked out my Facebook yet, Chris Jackson Rojas. It's on Facebook. Subscribe. And Putin's Putin meeting with European leaders might be going a little bit differently now. I think it's all a show, this whole thing that Trump's apparently having a fallout between some of these NATO allies. I don't think it's actually happening. I think it's somewhat of a ploy, maybe to even lull Russia into a sense of false security, because I just don't believe it. I just don't believe that the United States is actually going to, kind of ditch the NATO project, the whole thing that was really their creation. And, Donald Trump has shown himself to be a globalist, but then in another moment he does something that suggests maybe he's not. But, literally a few weeks ago we saw him holding a big orb that resembled a globe with the Saudi billionaire and the Egyptian president, which, I've talked good about the Egyptian president in the past, but to me, he's kind of shown he's sold out recently, and that really does when he's, hanging out with the Saudi billionaire and Donald Trump there. By the way, that Egyptian president's name's Al-Sisi, who took power in 2013 after the second Egyptian revolution. There was the original one in January 2011, and then in summer 2013, the Egyptian government fell, and Al-Sisi took power, and then he was elected in June of 2014, and now he's been the president since. But Sisi is the leader of Egypt, and he's kind of towed a pro-Israel line. He has stopped the tunnels coming from Gaza, and ultimately, when it comes to Syria, apparently, though, he's taken not too strong of a stance for the Syrian rebels. Some of the pro-Syrian community likes Egypt, but I don't know. He's also, I think, been part of the coalition, however, against the Yemeni Houthi government that's pro-Syrian, pro-Iranian. So there'd be a contradiction there. And that seems to be kind of his foreign policy. It's kind of contradictory to its... And the Libyan situation with Egypt is also kind of interesting because they've attacked Libya. The United States was against that when they attacked the ISIS there, and they did airstrikes against ISIS there. And Egypt is in a weird spot, and it seems to be some of the countries in the Middle East, they're in a weird spot. But Turkey, for example, they also appear to be on one of those weird spots where they seem to be having some kind of rapprochement with Putin, but at the same time, toe the same pro-NATO, pro-United States stance, and also have a hardline stance against Assad. I think that Turkey ultimately, though, is just playing a game. In the end, it's going to return to normal hostility between Turkey and Russia. They were actually very tense with each other in 2015. Remember when they shot and it was October 31st, 2015. So now it's been about a year and a half since that point. And it's kind of interesting how the relationships have turned, especially around the time of the coup in mid-2016. And now that Erdogan has a sweeping presidential power. After 19 years in power, I wonder how much longer can Erdogan continue to control this country. I feel like that eventually he might be deposed because of the just growing anger in his country due to his dictatorial sweeping reforms after the referendum and also shutting down Twitter, Facebook, and also multiple repression of dissidents in the country. He has jailed thousands. Erdogan is no friend to democracy, and I'm hoping that we'll see Erdogan's proposal soon. The problem with Turkish politics, however, it seems like every time there's coups all the time. In the end, just a pro-American guy wins in the end. The Syrian situation is also heavily reliant on what goes around from the neighboring countries, because the neighboring countries had a big part in financing terrorists in around them. And Syrian rebels' money is coming a lot from the Gulf states, which ultimately is just an extension of the United States imperialist wing. Also, it's the Israelis that have a lot of influence in these different countries when it comes to Bahrain, comes to Qatar, comes to Kuwait. You know, there's actually quite a few of these Gulf states, and you kind of forget about them. One country almost never mentions Oman, which I don't really know too much about Oman. Really, the only thing I know is that one of Gaddafi's sons ran there after the deposal of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. But that's like the only one that really I don't even mention out of the Middle East. It's kind of weird. You know, it's like I mentioned Afghanistan, I mentioned Iraq, I mentioned Pakistan even. Pakistan's kind of lesser because they're a pro-American country. There's not really too much fighting that happens there. They don't come in too much into play when it comes to stuff like Syria and Iraq. One thing about Pakistan is interesting, though, is that during the 80s, they financed the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and Stan and the United States worked together with to help the Mujahideen counter the Soviets in Afghanistan. That is one thing that is, I guess it's interesting to note. But it's not too much, really. It's kind of weird. They get caught up, I think, with their own border dispute with India, that they stay out of a lot of the other stuff. Nowadays, apparently, Pakistan and Russia's militaries have been working together, which, if that's the case, this is going to be pretty interesting, the future that Pakistan might have. Also, Pakistan is the only Middle Eastern country besides Israel that has nuclear weapons. The United States gave them nuclear weapons in the 70s, and I don't know if they'll come back to bite them in the ass by the fact that they'll have a country that's hostile to them with nuclear weapons. Iran, of course, they've been saying has been 6 months away from a nuclear weapon for 30 years. I don't think that they have nuclear weapons, but if they did, it's totally justified considering the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, and they got their nuclear weapons illegally. Remember that JFK tried to stop Israel from getting nuclear weapons in the 1960s, and he was going to send miners to the Dimona nuclear plant, but then he got assassinated, and all that came to an end. It was also said that Israel might have helped South Africa get their nuclear weapon program, which is not the South Africa today, but the apartheid South Africa of the 1970s, 80s, 90s. The apartheid South Africa fell apart in 1993, and it was, remember, that it was a white minority ruled over a black majority country. So Israel might have not only built their own nuclear weapons program, but they might have helped another country receive theirs. And there's a few other nuclear powers around the world. There's actually none in South America. There's only one over here in the Americas, which is the United States. And most of them are in Europe. I think it's UK, France, Germany. I'm not sure. I don't think Germany has nukes. Let's see. There's Russia, of course. 4, 5, let's see, 4 so far. I think the name 6, China 7, India 8, North Korea 9. No, I think that's right. I think there's only 9 right now. And then South Africa is the only country formally to have had nukes, but they gave up their nukes supposedly in the 1990s. When it comes to the fucking Israelis, it's that the Israeli government, that's another one of their hypocrisies, that they have all these nuclear weapons. They have over 400 nuclear weapons. They got it illegally. They talk about how Iran's getting their nuclear weapons illegally, and all they've been shown to use their nuclear energy for is for nuclear energy. They have not used their nuclear. They have not been shown to have nuclear weapons. Not been shown to have been building ICBMs or nothing. And yet they freaked out for years and talked about how close they are to being annihilated by Iranian nuclear weapons. These fictional Iranian nuclear weapons that I don't even believe are ever going to exist. And they've assassinated their scientists. They've used some of the Jewish community of Iran for sabotage against their own country. But ultimately, I think they were like people that were loyal to Israel that they implanted into the Jewish community in Iran. However, that's the thing. Most of the Jewish community in Iran is loyal to Iran. So that shows that the whole idea of anti-Semitism in Iran is false. When you have Jews that are respected, live peacefully in Iran, and why would they be loyal to a country that hates Jews? These Jews love Iran, and they're trying to tell you that Iran is 100% anti-Jewish, 100% anti-Israel. It is 100% anti-Israel, but it is not 100% anti-Jewish. And that's one of the things they love to connect, is that if you're anti-Israel, you must be anti-Jewish. They've stolen the name of Jews around the world and using Jews as human shields. It's my favorite quote, that Israel uses Jews as human shields. Like they always claim that the Palestinians are that they use their own as human shields. That's relatively not true. I don't think maybe Hamas, but then again, Hamas seems to be its own organization that the Israelis may or may not help because it seems to be like the perfect boogeyman. They always say that Hamas is out to attack them or whatever. Hamas is shooting rockets. It gives them no justification to do a lot of the horrible things that they do in Gaza and the West Bank. By the way, I think it's good. This is probably about where it's going to be edited out. So thanks everyone for tuning in to UCY.TV. This is your host, Chris J. This is Sunday, June 4th. We're approaching the top of the hour. We're about to hit the bumpers. It's going to be Immortal Technique. Point of no return. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and have a good night. I'll continue here at Blog Talk Radio for a few more minutes here. Before I go, finish what I was going to say, and then I'm probably not going to go for the third hour, so it's getting kind of sore. I did go for a 3-hour broadcast not that long ago. It was pretty impressive for me, because I know it was the second person, but still, I hadn't done a 3-hour broadcast in a while, and because I've been doing 2-hour broadcasts at UCY TV since I came in June 2015. So to go 3 hours was pretty fun, and we talked about a lot there. We had a kind of a heated debate for about 35 minutes or whatever. But talking about on this show, that when it comes to Voice of Rebellion, or when it comes to what to talk about? Yeah, when it comes to Israel, it's just the whole nuclear argument is so hypocritical, and it's awful. To me, Iran is well within their rights to obtain nuclear weapons if they believe that's going to keep them safe. And I think the nuclear deterrent would not be the dumbest idea, considering the fact that you look what happened in Iraq, you look what happened in Syria. They did not have nuclear weapons. They try to lie. They try to make it seem like that Iraq might have had nuclear weapons. They knew they didn't have nuclear weapons, and they knew the WMDs were a myth. WMDs was one of the biggest lies of the century, and that's been 14 years since it's happened, and still its effects are very well seen in Iraq today, and it's well seen with our politics today. The same lie, how they can blatantly lie to us. It's like the WMDs, now it's the chemical weapons. You had Colin Powell pretty emphatically saying how they had WMDs in Iraq. There were no fucking WMDs. In Iraq, Syria, the chemical weapons that supposedly Assad gases on people on the eve of victory, unlikely. Definitely not true in my opinion. And the idea that in Iran that they're developing nuclear weapons, that they're so close to developing nuclear weapons, to me is also a lie. So many lies being pushed about the Middle East, so many lies also, the huge one about Russia, that they hacked the election, is also another lie.
This is Ozzy's